always knew preaching was tricky. But I don't think I realized it was tricky for Jesus. And that's what we see in the parable of the sower. In the Gospel of Matthew, we hear more than in the other Gospels of the difficulties that faced Jesus anytime he preached or taught, how people responded. And so in this parable, he is giving the missionaries of the disciples hope. It's not your message, it's not the teachings I have given you that are the reason for this. It's that people are in different places, and they may not be ready to receive what I am teaching. If it was hard for Jesus, I feel a little bit better that it's hard for me. Because the reality is, I can't control what happens once I speak. And neither could he. By our standards today, Jesus was producing a pretty weak ministry. Not too many followers. Even the 12 closest folks who knew of him and listened to him didn't do that great when they came to times of testing. Even Peter was called Satan. Judas ends up turning him over for arrest and betrayal. And after he is arrested, they all flee. Not a lot to stand on. Good thing that Jesus' ministry is not judged by our standards of success in ministry today. Because if it was, I don't think we would be here this morning to worship the one who proclaims love, peace, and hope. And yet it was tricky. It was complex. Jesus was often walking and crowds were coming to him, and he didn't know who was in that crowd. And so he had no way to alter or tweak his message or what we in preaching classes were taught, which was to exegete the congregation. He didn't have that ability. He had to stay true to the message that he had been given and to preach the best way he knew how. And so there were times that people didn't like what he had to say. There were often times that religious leaders called him into question and said, "How can you offer forgiveness?" And Jesus would remind them, "Isn't it easier to heal than to offer forgiveness?" And yet he did both. He was constantly being challenged. And what we can take from that is that living in community is difficult. That amongst us today, there are likely the four soils present: the path, the rocks, the thorns, and the rich soil. Not because any of us are bad disciples, but because sometimes we're not ready to hear what Jesus is teaching. And the fact that we're all at different places makes this work of living out the good news incredibly tricky. Because what I may understand to be the good news may not be what you understand to be the good news. And so we may think we're having the same conversation when we're really speaking past one another. And so Jesus is reminding the disciples that it is through relationships that we are able to engage the complexities of discipleship. That whether we are on the path, whether we are the rocks, the thorns, or the good soil, we are continually being pursued by the God of love. And that just because we will have all of these groundings as we receive the word doesn't mean that we won't have the good soils sometimes. It also mean it won't be the chance for us to flee when things get hard. It might even mean that we cling to the teachings of Jesus because it sounds so exciting, and then we realize it costs us our very life and we say, "No, thanks. And sometimes we just miss the message altogether because we're not ready. And the beauty that we see with the disciples is even as they are being blessed in the parable of the sower, in the Ascension story right before our text today, they doubted the women who proclaimed that Jesus was not in the tomb. And even Cleopas, who saw Jesus on the road and broke bread with him, still did not believe that it was the resurrected Christ who stood before him in the upper room. The disciples continually got it wrong. Not because they were terrible, but because what they were being asked to do was lean into the mysteries of God. Leaning into the mysteries are difficult because we are people who like to know for sure. We like to have plans. We like to know that the path we are going on is a good path and that we are doing the best that we can. And all Jesus ever did was say, here are the mysteries of the kingdom of God. They are here for you. Do with them as you wish. He never forced anybody to believe a certain thing, but he continually taught and engaged people as best as he could. And then he let go. He let the seeds fall where they may, and he nurtured as he was able to. And so for us today, I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged because in our own congregation, we have people of differing theologies and differing beliefs. And sometimes this work of being in community together is hard because our faith is so personal that sometimes when we hear somebody else profess a different interpretation of what we thought to be true, it feels like they are questioning our very discipleship. That they are saying that we understand Jesus poorly or wrong, and that feels painful. How could they say that? How could they do that? And this is what the disciples were faced with. When Jesus would speak of loving your neighbor, everybody said, well, that sounds nice. I'm on board. And then interpretations of who thy neighbor is came into play. How love actually looked. And did we really have to do it all the time, or could we self-select? Our interpretations will always be right and always be wrong to someone. And so what we learn from Jesus in this parable of the sower is to open our hands a bit more. To allow our beliefs not to be threatened when someone has a differing interpretation, but to say, tell me more because I don't see it, but I want to understand where you're coming from. So often we are waiting just for the other person to stop talking so that we can prove them wrong. No, here's really the interpretations of God. I have the answers. You are welcome. How often does that work for us? But what if we approach those conversations not predetermining what soil the seed will land on? Not looking at somebody and saying, well, clearly you're the path, or you're the rocks, or you're the thorns, or, ooh, you look like good soil. I bet this will land. We are not the ones to determine where people are at. We are the ones to do our best to profess our understanding of the good news. And then to say, what do you think? But we have to be in relationship with each other. Yeah, that whole community piece that we talk so often about. It's not cheap talk. It is painful, it is annoying, it is beautiful, it is vibrant. it is risky. Because I have to actually let you show up. I don't get to predetermine who you are. I don't get to say that, well, you're not ready for this. I don't get to determine where you stand with God. But what it does mean is that I got to show up too. And I don't want to show up half the time. Because you may not like what you see. You may judge me. You may think that my understandings of God are completely false. You may think I'm a rock or I'm a thorn. And yet, if we in this together, we got to be all in. Not this surface level hospitality, but that radical hospitality that Jesus always talked about. The one that says, bring all that you are ashamed of, and I will give you forgiveness. In the presence of Christ, there is no shame, mind you. In the presence of Christ, there is only grace, mercy, and forgiveness. And so when we're standing in relationship with each other, my theology being different than yours, your theology being whatever it may be, it may feel threatening to me. And yet, in reality, all that is society saying, lean into that fear. Lean into that disconnect. Allow there to be strife. Don't go further. Don't break bread. Do not welcome. Be afraid. And yet, Jesus is saying the exact opposite. Even to those who did not trust or believe in him, he kept showing up. He kept presenting himself fully in the mysteries of God. And that's hard because the mysteries of God we want answers for. We don't want them to stay mysteries. We want to be certain and have clarification so that we know we are good disciples. And yet we worship a God that we say took on flesh and walked amongst us. I don't know about you, but that's pretty mysterious. We worship a God that says reconciliation is possible. I don't know about you, but that's pretty mysterious. And we worship a God that says love is all we need. That is pretty mysterious. And so in this risky discipleship journey that we are on, may we not look for answers more often than we lean in love. May we continually be willing to be wrong, but may we lean into hope of proclaiming the good news. Because if not, we may have seen the Ascension story a little bit differently. If the disciples had leaned into their fears and gone back into their room like they did after the crucifixion, would they have gone back to Jerusalem in joy, worshiping God in the temple? They would have hidden. It would have stifled the good news. And so no matter where we are in our discipleship journey, the risk is that we still believe. That we trust that this walking humbly with our God thing is worth it. That to seek justice means we're willing to risk what may seem comfortable for us so that all have what they need. And that doing mercy means that fairness is thrown out the door and that we lean into equity, realizing what may be best for me may not be best for you, and that's okay. Because in the gospel, there is always an abundance. There is never a shortage. And if you ever hear anybody say there is, invite them in to the story once again. Don't argue, but invite them into conversation. Be willing to be present, to be patient, and to maybe even be proven wrong on some of your own beliefs. Jesus never told us we would be right. And my husband can attest, I like to be right. And yet, what we are told is that we will be blessed. And in the Gospels, we see that blessing means speaking well of. So Jesus is speaking well of you, my dear siblings in the Spirit. We receive that same blessing that they received during the parable of the sower, and we receive that perpetual blessing as Jesus ascended into the heavens. That blessing never stops. We breathe it in, we breathe it out. It is the blessing that grounds us in the fact that what Jesus taught isn't fairy tale. It's hard, but it's worth it. And so we lean into the mysteries of God, being willing to be surprised along the way, knowing that we can walk by what we know and we can lean into the mysteries of God all at the same time. That our doubts are welcomed, for faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is the space where joy, hope, and doubt abide all in one. Faith is not this passive thing we lean on. Faith is this thing we wrestle with and gives us energy to go to the next step. The trick is we're all at different steps, though. So may we be patient with one another. May we say, I'm grateful for where you are at. I bless where you are at. And when you are ready for the next step, whatever that may be, I will journey with you. And may that be done for one another. May there be reciprocity. And may we be willing to risk this thing we call community. It's hard. It's complex. Because we are tricky individuals. But I think the mystery in our trickiness is that we are made in the image of a vast and abiding God. And that in that we cannot be winnowed down to one thing. So just as we cannot answer the mysteries of God, may the mysteries of our belovedness not be answered in full either. But may they give us encouragement. May they give us the confidence to say, I am a beloved child of God. I will screw up. I will fail. I will proclaim. And I will do my best in loving. And may we be in relationship with each other so that when I cause you harm, you can tell me. So that I have a chance to reconcile. Because the teachings of Jesus were often about radical hospitality, continual confession, unmeasured repentance and forgiveness, abiding love, and joyful celebration. So in a world that seems too daunting to take the next step, in a community where all four soils are present, in a world that tells us it ain't worth it, may we boldly proclaim otherwise. And may we always show up, for the mysteries of God will greet us. Amen.